Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
With your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ali. Well, welcome everyone. So I'm Peter Milligan. I'm an Australian business psychologist based in the UK. I've been here about 15 years. And as Ali said, I've been doing this work for about 22 years. I've worked with hundreds of business owners and leaders, helping them to get better results with less stress and less effort. So in this session, I'm going to be focusing specifically on emerging leaders. So these are corporate professionals who are typically in their 30s to mid-40s, and they're stepping up into bigger roles, or they aspire to step up into bigger roles. Now, in my experience, this is a challenging time, and without the right levels of confidence and maturity, people can make it hard for themselves and also other people. And I know that from my personal experience having done that, and also from having worked with so many other emerging leaders. Now, when emerging leaders struggle, it undermines team and business success. And the truth is, it doesn't have to be that way. So that's why I've called my session, How Emerging Leaders Can Step Up Without Tripping Up. So to kick off the session, I want to start with telling you a little bit about how I came to do what I do and why I feel so strongly about this topic. So I grew up on a farm in Australia, about 200 miles north of Melbourne. I had no desire to be a farmer. As a kid growing up, I had a big interest in aeroplanes. And by the time I was a teenager, I decided that I wanted to fly fast jets. So my goal was to try and join the Air Force as air crew. And as you can imagine, it's very competitive. And I went through the selection process and didn't make it all the way. So clearly that wasn't going to be for me. So we sold the family farm and we moved to the city of Adelaide. And my first career was in computer programming. So if you can see a picture of a big computer on the screen there, that's one of the early systems that I worked on before the PC was even invented. And I did that for a number of years, but I decided it wasn't really for me, because the truth is I was more interested in people development than software development. So I quit my job and went traveling around the world for a year, which was a fantastic experience. And as soon as I got back, I went to university full time. And I studied psychology and anthropology because I have a fascination with both people and cultures. And eventually I went on to qualify as an organizational psychologist. And my first job in that industry was when I joined a leading HR consulting firm called Speakman Stillwell. And this is where my story is quite significant around what I do. Because at this stage, I'm now in my 30s. I've joined this company, and within a year of joining, they actually put me into a management role. So the business was growing quite quickly, and I found myself the youngest member of the management team. So I was quite ambitious and keen to succeed. So I was very excited about getting this opportunity. But the truth is I wasn't really ready to step up into a leadership and management role. And I found this period of my life quite difficult. I was learning a new profession. I was having to learn how to sell and deliver professional services. And now I'm stepping up into management and leadership. And in parallel with that, I'm starting a family. Now, I struggled, but I was determined to succeed. But I had what's called the imposter syndrome. I felt like I was waiting to be found out. I was the youngest member of the management team, and I quite often struggled with this stuff. Now, a big change for me occurred when I started coaching other leaders, because I introduced a new service into our business, which today we would call executive coaching. And I was working with a lot of leaders and up-and-coming leaders, and I began to see that actually what I was going through in my 30s was something that many others were going through as well. So I realized that it was not uncommon. But I also realized without the right level of support, it's a very, very difficult time. And that's why I dedicated my whole career to helping people like this. So it was a very, very steep learning curve, and it really does underpin what I do today. In the year 2000, I moved to the United Kingdom, and I had the privilege of joining a company called the Change Partnership. And back then it was the leading executive coaching business in Europe and probably the world at that time. And then we were acquired by the UK's leading headhunting or executive search firm called Whitehead Mann. And then exactly 10 years ago next week, I decided to set up my own business, which I called New Generation Leaders. And it really is about a commitment to helping the next generation of leaders to be the kind of leaders we need. Now, to give you a sense of the essence of what I do, or the principle behind what I do, I want you to imagine that you've had delivered to your home this beautiful car, and you can't wait to take it out for a drive. So you take it out onto the road, and as you go into first gear, you feel this incredible acceleration. You shift into second gear, and by the time you're in second gear, you're already getting up to close to a speed limit. And you've still got 4 more gears. And then something happens and you realize that you can't get to the next level. So already you are going fast, you do look good, but there's more performance there. And this is the reality for many businesses and for many individuals, where they're doing okay, they appear to be successful, but somehow there's another level that they need to get to and they want to get through to because they know they can do it, but they're just not sure how. So what I do is I help unlock the things that block people from moving to the next level. So to give you a quick overview of this session, I'm going to talk about 2 powerful human emotions. They're emotions that we all have, and they can work for us, but they can also be quite damaging to us if we're not careful. I'm going to share with you the 2 biggest factors that impact career and leadership success. I'm going to give you some keys to communication effectiveness that can make a massive difference. I'm going to look at why impatience can, ironically, slow down your progress. And this is very relevant to those young, ambitious leaders who want to progress very quickly. We're going to talk about how to understand and work with the invisible and informal power structures, because a lot of younger leaders don't get the power of these things, and it's important to understand it. And then we'll have any questions and answers. So let's kick off with the emotions. Back in 2000, I left Australia to come and live in the UK with my wife and our 5-year-old son. Now, I really fondly remember those days, and I remember these 2 main emotions, because for us it was a big adventure. You see, we didn't know how things were going to work because we had no employment and we had nowhere to live when we arrived here. But we were optimistic and we were very excited. So we had these 2 emotions running. The first one was excitement, because it's a new adventure and there's all these new possibilities out there for us. So it was a very exciting time. But now and then I'd feel this other emotion, which you probably won't be surprised to know is fear. Because the reality is that we had to find work within 2 or 3 months, because otherwise our money would have run out. So those 2 emotions are with us all the time. And the interesting thing about these 2 emotions is that they're really close cousins, because physiologically they're pretty much the same. You have the adrenaline, the heart rate, and the only difference really is how you think about what's going on. So something can be exciting and frightening, and we really have to make a decision how we're going to feel about what's going on right now. Now, how these emotions work for us? Well, this is the purpose they have. You see, every moment of your life, you are surrounded by 2 things. Whether you see them or not, they're definitely out there. And this applies to businesses and it applies to individuals. Whether you see them or not, there are always opportunities. Hopefully you'll see more and more of them. But at the same time, there are a lot of dangers, and hopefully you'll see them before they get you. So the emotions help us in a very important way if we know how to master them. But if they're in charge, we're in trouble. Let's start with fear. So there's a great quote from Tony Robbins. It's, "Let fear be your counselor, not your jailer." Now think about your own life. Think about the times when you've allowed fear to be your jailer. You know, where it stops you doing something that would have been good to do. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've done that. I do remember one time, I was 20 years old. I'd been out on a date with a very attractive young lady. I really liked her. I thought she liked me. I was hoping she did. We went back to her place after being out for dinner, and we're sitting there together having a great conversation. And in my mind, tonight's the night we're going to have that first kiss, because to me this is a symbol of the fact that we're more than just friends. And as the evening rolls on, something really weird happened. My excitement about this opportunity that I had turned into a fear of danger. And as you can imagine, the danger that I thought was that she might reject me. And that was an example where fear became my jailer. It stopped me. I'm sitting there scared, she's sitting there confused. So fear is definitely valuable in that it keeps us alert to potential dangers and problems. But too much of it, and it paralyzes us, it stops us taking action that we really ought to take. Now the same principle applies with excitement. So for example, back in 2007, my wife and I made some investments in property-related investment opportunities. Now, when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, we ended up losing a lot of money and ended up with a lot of debt that we didn't or shouldn't have had. And the reason is that the people who we invested with went out of business and they went bankrupt, and we lost a lot of cash and ended up with a lot of debt. Now you might say, well, that happened to a lot of people, and even intelligent investors made mistakes, and you'd be right. But the one thing I know is this: at the time I was so excited about the opportunity that I was not interested in the dangers at all. I didn't get any decent advice, independent advice. I didn't do any research on the people we invested with, and if I had, I probably wouldn't have invested. So with excitement, it does add a lot of value in that it keeps us positively energized. But one of the dangers of excitement is that it blinds us to important facts. Just like the little girl in the picture there, she's got all this excitement in her body, but she's actually got her eyes shut, so she doesn't see things going on. Whereas the man with the wide open eyes is having a lot of fear. He's seeing things, but he's perhaps not able to move. So like all things in life, it's about balance. You see, we need excitement to keep vision, to have the vision to see the opportunities and the energy to go after them. You wouldn't have achieved success in your life if you hadn't had that. But at the same time, we need a little bit of fear, just enough to keep us alert to the potential dangers that can exist out there. And managing emotions is one of the keys of being a great leader. We have to manage our own emotions, and we have to learn how to deal with and manage other people's as we work with them. So I'm going to now move on to the topic of career derailment. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, career derailment is when we're on a track to success, we're doing very well, and then something goes wrong. And in the extreme, it can mean that people get fired, they lose their job because something goes wrong. Now, for organizations who invest a lot in their high potential people and their talent, they need to understand how derailment can occur, because they often identify people as having a lot of potential, but yet some of those people don't fully realize their potential. So back in the 1980s, there was a major piece of research kicked off by the Center for Creative Leadership in the USA. And they wanted to get underneath this issue. They wanted to understand why people who've got a lot of potential don't achieve that potential. And this was a global study where they interviewed thousands and thousands of people to try and work out what the factors were. Now, they came up with a number of factors, but the two biggest factors by far I'm going to share with you. The first one is the inability to develop or adapt. Now, when I first saw this, I thought that was really curious because it seemed to me that people with a lot of potential and people who were already doing well in their early career must have developed and adapted to get to where they've gotten to. So the big question is, why do they lose that? What goes wrong? Well, I think the best way to understand that is to look at the learning process. And this is a model from Abraham Maslow, which you may have seen, although perhaps not the way I represent it. So all of us start out with a blind spot. We don't know that we can't do something. When I was a kid growing up in Australia, I didn't know that I couldn't ice skate. Now you can probably imagine why I didn't know that, because there was no ice to skate on where I grew up. I lived beside a lake. That lake never froze over. And here's the other, and the closest ice rink would have probably been 200 miles away. So I had no experience of seeing ice skating. But here's an interesting point. Even if I had seen it, for example, I may have seen it on television, I might not have realized I couldn't do it. Do you know why? Well, if you think about it, people who do something really well make it look really easy. So I could have had the illusion that ice skating was very easy. But of course, when we try something, we often wake up to the fact that it's not as easy as it looked. I hear a lot of people being very critical of leaders and managers, and all I say to them is wait till you get there, because it's not as easy as you might think, and you'll have some of the same challenges. Now, when we get to this realization point, we have a choice, don't we? We can choose to just give up and say it's not for me. In fact, I had a painful realization about ice skating, because here in the UK, I stepped onto an ice rink, I fell so hard I nearly broke my arm, and I decided that it wasn't for me. But if we want to become good at something, we obviously need to practice. And as you might recall, when you're learning a new skill, it's a difficult, challenging time because you have to think about everything you're doing. But eventually, if we practice for long enough, we get to a point of mastery where we no longer have to think consciously about it, and it becomes easy for us to do it. Now, I've also put the word habit there. And here's a question for you. Is habit a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think? Well, if you think about it, you'll probably realize that habits can be a good thing or a bad thing. It really depends. So the truth is, some habits are really, really valuable. They can even save your life. 35 years ago yesterday, on the 21st of June in 1980, I stepped into a car with 4 other friends. We'd been to a party and we were going home. We were driving down a country road, and as we came to a give way sign, my friend who was driving fell asleep at the wheel, and we went through a give way sign and we got hit by a truck at high speed. And this is the photo of the wreckage. I was sitting in the seat closest to the camera. I was closest to the point of impact. And the reason that I'm alive today is because I had a habit of putting on my seatbelt. Even if I'm tired, even if I've had a few drinks and I'm not thinking much, I just put my seatbelt on. One of our friends who was sitting furthest from the point of impact, in the back seat of the car, the window in his door is still intact. The glass didn't break, but he died because he didn't have the habit of putting on his seatbelt. So there's no doubt that habits are valuable, but sometimes they can become a problem for us. And to understand how, let's go back to Maslow's model. So when we get to this point of habit and mastery, what can happen is that the environment changes, the demands on us change, and suddenly the thing that came so easily is becoming a problem for us. And this is very relevant to leaders, because when we step up into leadership from being a technical specialist, suddenly it's not enough to be a very good technical specialist. You need to have a whole raft of new skills. And it's not good enough to just keep doing more of what you used to do. The Centre for Creative Leadership's research came up with something called the 30-40-50 rule. And what it says is that the qualities that got you promoted by your 30s can lead to your derailment in your 40s and 50s. In other words, your old success strategy can become your failure strategy if you're not careful, and you need to wake up. So very simply, here's a way of looking at it. When we start out as what I call a young professional, what gets us noticed and promoted is a whole raft of different qualities and behaviours. And the interesting thing is that as we progress, we need to become the mature professional. This is an ongoing journey, by the way. It's not a single one step, but it's an ongoing journey. But what makes us successful later in life is to develop a broader toolkit. And that toolkit, interestingly, looks very different from the one that made us successful early in our career. Now, I'll draw your attention to the ambition and high standards piece, because when we start out in our career, early on in our 20s, we are very keen to prove ourselves. And that's based in reality because we don't have a long track record. But if we're still behaving that way later in life, we look a bit silly, because although we're constantly growing and developing all through our lives, the mature professional has a somewhat different style about them, because they've got this sense that they have arrived. They don't have to prove anything anymore. Now, please understand this. This is not about complacency or arrogance. Far from it. The mature professional is actually the opposite. They're actually more open about their humanity. They're aware of their shortcomings. They are willing to admit their mistakes. They're willing to acknowledge that they don't have all the answers. And yet they feel confident that one way or another they'll work it out. We'll come back to that point a little later. But one of the things that happened to me when I came to the UK is when I joined the Change Partnership, in my first few months there I got some feedback from one of my colleagues, and he said to me, Peter, when we have an offsite with the team, when we go away and we spend time together as a team to discuss the business, he said, you sometimes say things that don't really need to be said. Now, it wasn't a harsh criticism, but I did take it very hard, because I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where people are talking, someone's talking and you're thinking, this is really not adding any value and I wish you'd just shut up. Now, it's easy to spot it in other people, but how do we know whether we're doing that? And it worried me that I'd be doing this, and I didn't want to lose the respect of my colleagues. So I thought about how I'd get around this, and I decided that what I would do is whenever I felt the urge to speak, I'd ask myself a simple question. I'd do a simple test. Is my main reason for speaking justification? Am I doing it because I just want to look good? I'm just thinking about myself and wanting to impress people. Or is my main reason for speaking contribution? Am I primarily concerned with adding value? And am I thinking not just about me, but everybody? Now, I've taught this to hundreds of people who've used it very effectively, and I've found it really helpful. And I'm not saying I got it right every time, but I promise you there are times when I stopped myself because I knew that it was more about me and my ego rather than what would be good for the meeting right now. Now, in my view, all of us are on a journey towards confidence, emotional maturity, and wisdom. It's a very important journey to take for any emerging leader. And the reason it's important is because as we move from left to right, and we spend more time in what I call the green zone, we have a deeper level of confidence that enables us to get more done more effectively with less stress. It is like shifting up another gear. Now, we're all human. We all have moments and we all have days when we're stressed and we're uptight and we're worried and things annoy us and frustrate us and we want to attack people or defend ourselves from other people. And any confidence that we might show is what I call false confidence. When people ask us how we are, we pretend that everything's fine when it isn't really. Or sometimes it comes across as arrogance. And I can promise you that if you come across someone who's very arrogant, if you scratch under the surface, deep down there will be some insecurities. and they're not perhaps willing to show those. So the name of the game is to spend more time in the green zone and less time in the red zone, because life just gets better. It gets easier. You handle things better. And you also become a much, much better leader. If there was a quality that underpinned the green zone, I would have to call it love, a sense of connection. And if there was something that was underneath the red zone, it would have to be fear, a sense of being quite separate. Now, I said earlier that a little bit of fear is a good thing because it keeps us alert. But in my experience, too many people have too much of it, and that causes too many of the problems that we see in the world and in our organisations. So in a nutshell, for me, this is the human evolutionary journey. We all have to take the journey moving left to right as best we can. And yes, we will slip back into the red zone from time to time. But the thing that makes the difference is knowing that we've done that and pulling ourselves back to the green zone and helping others to spend more time there as well. And that leads nicely to the other main cause of career derailment, which you probably won't be surprised to hear, that it is problems with interpersonal relationships. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If you can't get on with your direct manager or some of your colleagues or even your customers or your suppliers, it's going to limit how far you're going to go. And in the extreme, it can mean you lose your job or you lose your business. Now, when I ask people what do they think the important things are in relationship building, they inevitably say it's communication. And I would agree. In fact, I think the three most important things are communication, communication, and communication. Because the reality is that that's what a relationship is built on, good communication. But there are three different areas in which we can think about our communication. So we can think about a communication with external parties outside our business, outside our organisation, our customers, our suppliers, the regulators, anyone we have to deal with. We need to get good at that. We have to be good at communicating internally within our organisation, within our team. And there's somebody else that we need to be good at communicating with too. And perhaps you've guessed, it's yourself. Because you're having a dialogue with yourself all the time. And quite often that isn't actually a particularly helpful dialogue. So to become aware of that and to be able to monitor it and to know whether it's useful dialogue or not is really important. So when it comes to communication success, one of the things a lot of people say is, oh, we need more communication in our organisation or in our team. But you know what? I don't think they really want more. I think what they want is better. I don't know too many people who wake up in the morning and say, I've got 130 emails to process this morning. I wish I had 300 emails. You see, it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. So what does quality look like? Well, I got to see this firsthand in my own home several years ago. I have two sons. James is now 20 and Matthew is 14. And when Matthew was 7 years old, one morning he came into our bedroom. It was a school day. He said, I don't want to go to school today. Now, he doesn't normally say that. So we said, why? And he said, because I've got a tummy ache. He didn't feel well. Now, I know my son well enough to suspect that that isn't true. I was pretty confident that if I'd said, you don't have to go to school, that's okay. And by the way, I've got time after breakfast. Would you like to play football? I'm confident he would have said yes. So I decided that it wasn't real and he'd be okay. And I said, you're going to school anyway, you'll be fine. And the more I said that, the more he protested that he wasn't well. So there was lots of talking going on, but no real resolution. And then my wife steps in. She takes him and sits him down, the two of them in his room, and she says, what's going on, what's up? And he told her. He said, well, at the end of today I've got my drumming lesson. I have to leave my class 5 minutes early to get there. And when I'm standing outside the room, sometimes my teacher's not ready for me, for my lesson. And he said, I won't know what to say if someone says, why aren't you in class, Matthew? Have you ever done that, made up a story you couldn't cope with something? You see, he was quite sensitive and he wasn't very confident at the age of 7, and he didn't feel he could handle that situation. But by understanding that, Jane was able to help him see that he could, and that there were strategies he could deal with that. And within 2 minutes, the problem was solved. The tummy ache was gone, and I drove him to school, and he was singing in the car. He was so happy. But if we'd done it my way, he would have had a miserable day at school, and it wasn't quality communication. So that's what quality looks like. So how do we get quality? What do we need? Well, I think there are 3 keys. The first one is compassion. We have to connect to the emotions first, which is what Jane did. She wanted to know how he was feeling, what was really going on with him. If we go straight to logic, if we go to the head and we think about it, we end up in an argument about who's right and what's logical. But there's a deeper level of emotion at play. So we need to understand that and connect with that first. We need clarity. We need to understand and express what is really wanted. And for that to happen, we need to be open and relaxed. That morning, I wasn't open. I wasn't interested in what the real story was, and I wasn't relaxed. I just wanted to move things on. And yet Jane took the time, and it wasn't much time. This is the key point. It wasn't much time, but she listened to him, and she was able to find out what the issue was, what he really wanted. It wasn't that he didn't want to go to school. He just wanted to be able to handle a particular situation. And the final thing is we need collaboration. We need to find what our common interests are, what our shared goals are. Because when we think about our differences all the time, that just ends up in conflict. We have to move beyond our differences to remember our common interests and our common goals. Now, when I talk this through with people, people generally see this. They know this is true. Those of you listening at the moment, I'd be very surprised if any of you thought, I've never thought about that before. I've never seen that. Because this is pretty standard sort of stuff about us as people. So here's the big question. If it is so obvious that this is going to make life better for everyone and make business work better, why don't we do it? What is it that gets in the way? Well, I think there's a simple thing, and it's something that each one of us has. It's the human ego. Now, there's nothing wrong with ego in itself. I mean, ego is a sense of separate self. There's nothing wrong with that. Each of us has a different perspective. We live in a different body. We have different experiences. And when we come together and share that, that adds enormous value. Where the ego becomes a problem is when there's too much focus on ourselves. We're just thinking about us and not anyone else. That's when it's a problem. Albert Einstein is famous for this equation, E equals mc squared. But most people don't know that Albert Einstein had another equation regarding the ego. He said it is inversely proportional to the amount of knowledge we have. So the more knowledge you have, the less ego. There's an old saying, the beginning of wisdom is realizing how much you don't know. And that's absolutely key here. So what happens with a lot of younger up-and-coming leaders is they think they have a lot of answers, and they do have a lot of valuable perspectives, but they're so focused on themselves and their own career ambitions that they don't see the broader picture sometimes. In fact, this plays out in something I call impatient ambition. I've seen many very bright, very capable professionals who are wanting to progress to the next level, and yet they're so impatient to get there that it actually holds them back. I've seen many of their managers say he or she isn't ready. And the reason, one of the main reasons they're not ready is because of their impatience. If only they realized. There's nothing wrong with ambition, nothing at all. It's when we want it too quickly. We're pushing too fast and too hard for that. So sometimes they get held back. People will hold them back and hold them back and hold them back because they're so impatient. And that can make it worse because they become more impatient. And sometimes when they get their way and they do step up, but they're not really ready. And that happened to me. I stepped up. I wasn't pushing for it, but I was given the opportunity to step up. And I didn't say no because I wanted to progress. But I wasn't ready for it. And because of that, it actually became a problem and a challenge. So Impatient ambition has three sort of implications. It sends three messages. One is that it's quite possible that there isn't enough inner calm or true confidence, and that is essential to be an effective leader. So that's one problem. Another problem is that it suggests that you're more focused on yourself than the organisation and the team. You might have a great story that the organisation and the team needs you at the next level because you're so fantastic. But if your story is totally about yourself and you're not thinking more broadly, it's quite possible you're missing something. And thirdly, you're not correctly reading people in the context. There are probably signals coming back to you that you're not ready and you're not picking those up. And the fact that you're not picking them up suggests that you're not ready. A colleague I worked with years ago had a great saying, go slow to go fast. And I've found time and time again that sometimes you have to step back and get more things right before you move forward. And obviously as an executive coach, that's something I've helped many people to do. I love that title so much. It's actually the title of my book that I'm writing at the moment, which is coming out early next year. So if you're interested in getting early notification of that, just send me an email at the end of this session. Now, to counteract this, one of the things I teach is what I call the triangle of confidence. In fact, it's true confidence, confidence that runs deep. Now, we need to be clear on what our intentions are. That's born out of our desire to move to a better place and have something more in our lives. And that's quite natural. But at the same time, we need to be paying attention. We need awareness of what's going on right now. And many times people aren't doing enough of that. So you've got to know where you are at the moment. Now, there's nothing unusual about this. This is standard goal setting stuff. Know where you want to get to, know where you are now. But one of the things that isn't taught enough around this is the principle of detachment. Because with a bit of detachment, we're able to be more calm. We don't let things get to us. If we don't achieve our goal immediately, we're okay with that. We just go back and start again and work out what's next. The best way of illustrating this is interviewing, going for a job interview. And I've helped a lot of people with this. You see, when you go for a job interview, you have to be very clear what you want. You want to perform as best you possibly can. But at the same time, you have to be paying attention to what's going on in the interview. You have to have paid attention to who the organisation is, who you are. You bring all of that into the interview. But the other secret is detachment. You have to know that if this doesn't work out, that's okay. Because if you come across as desperate in the interview and too intense, that will probably lose you the job. And I know that's happened. I'm aware of that happening with people I've interviewed myself and stories I've heard. So that's very powerful. And one of the things that we need to keep balancing all through our lives is these three elements. And it's a key to great leadership. And that brings me on to the final point around control, power, and influence, which is something that every leader needs to understand and master. I interviewed someone recently for my book, someone who's had some very senior roles in major companies, and I said to him, what is one of the main mistakes that the younger up-and-coming leaders make? And he said to me, they don't understand and work with the shadow side of an organisation. What he means by the shadow side is the hidden stuff. So I'm going to use the iceberg analogy to illustrate that. You see, if you go into any business, any organisation, there will be the formal stuff, the stuff that is documented, written down. You can see it and touch it. Included in that is the reporting lines, an organisational structure and hierarchy. It's all there to be seen. But what we will not find anywhere formally documented is the informal, the stuff that just goes on. There might be words in a document about our culture, but sometimes the real culture isn't always what the words say. Sometimes the actual behaviours aren't what is really isn't what is talked about in the formal documents. because there's a whole lot of personal stuff going on and relationships and conversations and emotions, and this stuff's shifting all the time. And if we're not keyed into this, if we're not aware of it, then it can just, we're missing a trick because there's a lot of power there. Let me illustrate that very simply. Now, I haven't made up my own one of these. I've just borrowed this off the internet, but there is a formal organisational structure, and this is just an example of what one might look like. So we can see where people sit in the organisation and where the reporting lines are, and at the senior levels we can see what their roles are. But you won't find anywhere formally documented one of these. This is an illustration of what the relationships are in the organisation. So as an interesting example, we take Mr. or Ms. Fanning, who is the Vice President for Sales, and their only relationship really is with their direct reports. They don't have much of a relationship with the President or the other Vice Presidents. And that might be fine while sales is going really well. But if there are problems coming, if there's change coming, they might not get adequately tipped off. And if things are going badly, they won't necessarily have the support they need from other people. By contrast, we take this person called Kyle, and we don't know what their role is, but what we do know, looking at this chart, is that they're very well connected to all sorts of people, including the president. They've got good relationships, and because of that, they're probably going to get information that's useful, and they're going to have more influence around the place. And ultimately, that needs to be for good, because if it's not for good, if it's only for their own agenda, that becomes a problem, and it will eventually catch up with them. But if we assume that by and large it's in a positive sense, they'll continue to build great relationships, and they'll continue to be influential and get more opportunities. And that's why one of the key things I do with my clients is we invest time mapping and building key relationships. Now, everybody does this to some degree. I worked with a lot of very successful people. I've never met anyone who couldn't do this better with some conscious thought, because these things are constantly shifting and changing. So let me just summarize what we've covered then. We're constantly surrounded by opportunities and dangers, and the emotions of excitement and fear are very useful servants, but be wary of allowing either of those emotions from taking over. Remember that successful people constantly learn to adapt and evolve. No matter what level, no matter what age, we have to be able to do that. And we also must focus on building relationships. And these are particularly important when we're stepping up into leadership roles. Quality communication is the key. It's not about more, it's about better. So make sure that your communication is good quality. And remember that that means compassion, it means clarity, and it means collaboration. Ambition is a good thing, but when we're impatient, that becomes a problem for us and for other people. So be wary of that, and remember that the power of balancing intention, attention, and detachment. And also understand and work with those less visible factors, so become much more attuned. People call it emotional intelligence. That's certainly part of what it's about, being able to understand and read the systems that you're part of. So I'm now happy to take any questions, but before I do, I'm going to ask you a question. If you think about yourself, your life, or your organisation as having massive potential yet to be realised, the question is for you to consider is, what is it that you need to do to find that next gear? What's getting in the way? What will release that next bit of potential? So on that note, I'm going to hand over so Ali can take over, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to hear them. And beyond this session, if any of you have any further questions or want any further information, please feel free to contact me on the email address at the bottom of the screen.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Milligan, for a very interesting presentation. Folks, we are open for question and answers now. If you have any questions, you can put it in the question box, or you can always raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console, so if you click on it, I will unmute your microphone so you can speak directly to the teacher. With that note, let me go to the question box. The first question is, how can you know if a newly promoted leader is at risk of derailment?
That's a very good question. I think it's really important if you're managing one of those people or have some sort of awareness or responsibility of these people in your organization, you have to get connected to them well enough so that there's trust, and you have to watch them, because you might see signs that they're struggling a little bit, and sometimes they can come across as almost too confident. So one of the things that can work really well, you might be a mentor or you might be their line manager, is to take an interest in them as people and be willing to show some of your own vulnerability. So tell them your own stories, to share, how there were times where you struggled and how you dealt with those challenges yourself. Show yourself to be human, because it makes it more likely that they will feel safe to share that they're struggling. Because I know when I was in my 30s, and I know this is true for many people at this stage, is that we feel like everyone else is doing really well and we're the only one who's having some difficulties. So we keep it to ourselves because we don't want to show our weaknesses. So make it safe for them to talk about those. And in fact, if they say there are no problems or challenges, that's probably a good sign that they are struggling or they're going to have problems, because it means one of two things. They actually don't see the potential dangers, and that's dangerous, because they're going to have problems at some point because they're not attuned to what's going on around them or inside themselves. So either they don't see the dangers, or they don't feel confident enough to acknowledge those dangers to anyone else. So then they suffer on their own and they don't reach out for help. And that's the worst thing you can do, is to just be isolated. And that's why there's a lot of power in having mentors. Sometimes they have external mentors and coaches, people like me, to help to make it safe for people to talk about this stuff. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you very much. We have another one. How can emerging leaders build their personal brand and promote themselves without being seen as too self-centered, egoistical, and less interested in the team?
Well, that's another good question, and it's interesting for me as an Australian working in Great Britain. There's a very strong culture in Britain about not self-promoting, in contrast to, say, the United States, where people are strongly encouraged to sell and promote themselves and their products. So, like all things, it is about balance. You do have to know how to do it so that you are telling people about your achievements and what you're accomplishing and getting done. Because what often happens is people think, well, if I just do a good job, people will recognize that. But that's not always true. People aren't paying enough attention, and you do need to just show that you're achieving things. But you have to do it in a more subtle way, and it's important that you're not just talking about you, but you're talking about other people as well. So make sure there's a balance between talking about your successes and talking about other people's successes, because then you're showing that you're not just being arrogant and self-centered. One of the people that I work with as an associate or a partner sometimes, there's a company I do some work with who teach stuff around charisma. And one of the things that they say is that charismatic people have this ability to raise their own status and other people's status at the same time. So we like to be around those sort of people. We don't mind them talking about their own successes when they're happy to talk about ours as well. So we feel good around those people. So that's really the key, is to get the balance right.
Thank you very much. We have another one. as a new generation leader in today's fast-paced corporate world, end of the day, how much is it actually about being an actor or being a genuine leader?
Sorry, being an actor or a what?
Or being a genuine leader?
A genuine leader. I love that question. You know, in a way, it's a bit of a balance. I'm a big fan of being very authentic about who you are, but actually there's somebody who questions the whole authenticity movement. She says it holds us back in that if we just say this is who I am, we can't progress to something different. So we sometimes have to, there's an old saying, fake it till you make it. And if anyone's seen the famous TED video by Amy Cuddy about body language, and she has the term fake it until you become it. So there will be situations where you need to walk into a meeting with an air of confidence about you, even though privately you're having a little bit of self-doubt. But there'll be other times when it's highly appropriate to be very open and authentic with people, and they will very much appreciate that. And I think it's about being able to read the situation and make that judgment. So that's where there's value in having a really good mentor or a coach to talk that over with. But just being totally false all the time won't work, because people won't connect with you as a human being, and that will undermine you as a leader. But at the other extreme, if you're just constantly sharing all your deep fears and concerns and doubts all the time, that will also frighten people, because they'll feel like perhaps you don't really have the capacity to be a great leader. So it's knowing when it's appropriate to put on a brave face and, you know, talk with great confidence, and at other times to reveal who you really are.
Thank you very much, Peter, for a very detailed answer. Now we have one last question. What is the best way to handle a person with great potential but who has important ambition? How do you maintain their loyalty and motivation while holding them back from quick promotion?
Yeah, well, that's another good question, and this is an ongoing challenge, because people talk about the war on talent, you know, the war for talent, because companies are competing for the very best people. And if you've got someone who you consider to, you know, to be a great potential leader and having lots of potential capability, you don't necessarily want to lose that person. But if they've got the impatient ambition and they're not getting promoted as fast as they want, they're obviously going to be tempted by other organizations who will be offering them perhaps that opportunity to step up. So what's really important is to, you know, that they have someone who is a good mentor or line manager who's connecting with them and you know, saying that they can see their potential and showing them that they will have the potential to go even further if they continue to broaden their skill base. So it's very important to give them very honest feedback, showing them where they're really strong and showing them areas where they can make adjustments and improvements to step up. So they need attention from people, and they need valuable feedback. It's no good just telling them how fantastic they are but not promoting them, because they won't trust you. Sometimes what will happen is that people will deliberately hold these people back. In fact, in 1982, in December 2002, in the Harvard Business Review, there was an article called "The Young and Clueless" by Kerry Bunker, Kathy Cram, and Sharon Ting. And they talk about this problem, about people being promoted too quickly. And they say it's really important to hold them back sometimes when they haven't quite developed certain skills. For example, influencing is an absolutely essential skill for a leader to have. And the best way to develop that skill is to give people a role where they don't have direct control over people. So they can't use fear to motivate them. In fact, right now I'm working with a young leader who's of an engineering background, who is frustrated because there are people whose cooperation he needs, but he doesn't have line management responsibility for those people. So he has to find other ways to win these people over. So sometimes you can interrupt their ascent by holding them back, giving them a role where they need to develop those influencing skills. But when you do that, it's really important to explain to them why you're doing that, to show them that you are supporting them and that this is part of their development so that they can come to understand it. Sometimes, of course, there are things you can't tell the individual for various reasons. So, for example, many years ago in a major healthcare organisation, there was an individual who went for a business unit director role, and she was considered to have enormous potential, and they definitely wanted to keep her. And she went for a particular role that had come up, but they didn't want her to take that role. There was actually another role that they wanted her to take, but they couldn't tell her at the time because she didn't know about some changes that were coming. So they had to, tell her that she hadn't got the role, and they had to do it in a way so that she wouldn't decide, well, there's no opportunities for me, and leave the company, because they definitely didn't want to lose her. So they explained to her that she just missed out on it, and that there were just one or two little things that they wanted her to do some extra work on so she'd be ready next time. And then they brought me in as her coach. So that kind of showed that they treated her as a very valuable asset, and they wanted to, look after her and develop her because they made a major investment. And in fact, there were things that she and I were able to work on together. But I'd been briefed about this particular situation, and I wasn't to say anything, but I knew that they were keeping her warm so that when this next opportunity came up, they could promote her into that role. And of course, in time, that's exactly what happened. But what you don't want to be doing, see, it's really important to keep your word, because when you describe what you're doing with people, you have to keep your word. So if you say, oh yes, we'll promote you next time, and you don't promote them next time, that's when you're more likely to lose them. So once again, like everything, it's a bit of a balancing act. But as long as they feel like they're getting proper attention and they're getting good quality feedback that's very balanced and fair, and that you are committed to their development and their progression, then you're very likely to keep them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Milligan. That really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Not really. I think hopefully people have been able to take away something of value from the session. One of the things I say to people is that what I teach is not necessarily new. I think most of what I teach people kind of already know. They've heard it before. I think the real key is learning to implement it and use it. It's all very well to say, yes, there's a third and fourth gear and more in this car, but to know how to shift up a gear is really important. We have to know what to do and how to do it, and we need support and help to do that. So, remember these basic principles, but make sure that you're applying them in your life. Find people who can mentor you or coach you or support you to put these things into action, because these small things can make an enormous difference to your success. But as I say, if anyone's got any further questions or wants any further information about the sort of thing I do and how I help people, please feel free to drop me an email at any time, and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Well, thank you very much. I really want to thank you, Mr. Milligan, on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, for your valuable time and giving us this live presentation to the webinar platform. So thank you very much once again, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. It will be uploaded on Mile Community in the next couple of days, so please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org for accessing the archive section, and equally
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.